how a flood stranded 70,000 hippies. It is the night of Saturday, September 2nd, 2023, and a woman is standing ankle-deep in gray clay, watching her tent sink into the ground beneath her. Somewhere behind her, a man is screaming for a shovel because his RV has slid 3 feet sideways in the mud. Cell service is dead. The nearest paved road is 8 miles away, and every inch of the ground between here and there has turned into a substance that swallows tires, boots, and bicycles whole. 70,000 people are trapped in the middle of the Nevada desert, and not one of them can drive, fly, or bike their way out. Food is being rationed camp by camp. Generators are being switched off to save fuel. Somewhere out on the open Playa, rumors are already spreading about a death, about gunfire, about a city sliding into total chaos, and almost none of it can be confirmed because there is no signal to confirm it with. This is Burning Man, a festival built entirely on the idea that people can survive on their own out here, and for one terrifying weekend in 2023, that idea was put to the test in the worst possible way. Live in front of the entire country. Burning Man began in 1986 on a beach in San Francisco, when a small group of friends built a wooden effigy and set it on fire as a strange symbolic ritual. Within a few years, growing crowds and local restrictions pushed that ritual out of the city entirely. And by 1990, organizers had relocated it to the Black Rock Desert in northwestern Nevada, a place so remote and so empty that it became the perfect blank canvas for what Burning Man was trying to become. The festival now happens every year in the final week of August into the first week of September, and it has grown from a handful of people on a beach into a temporary metropolis of more than 70,000 attendees, all built from scratch in a matter of days and torn down just as fast, leaving behind nothing but flat desert once the week is over. The layout of Black Rock City itself is almost unrecognizable compared to any real town. Streets are arranged in concentric arcs that curve around a wide open plaza, forming something closer to the face of a clock than a normal city grid, with the wooden man standing at the very center where all 12 hours would meet. Attendees navigate using time-based addresses instead of street names, meeting friends at coordinates like 9 o'clock and E rather than a corner of Main and First. Scattered across the open Playa beyond the residential arcs sit the art installations that Burning Man has become famous for, pieces that attendees spend months building and then haul hundreds of miles into the desert purely to be seen for 1 week and then dismantled. It is a city built entirely on the premise that everyone inside it is a creator rather than a customer, and that premise depends completely on the ground beneath it staying dry. The location itself is part of what makes Burning Man so unusual, and also part of what made the 2023 disaster possible in the first place. Black Rock City sits on top of what used to be Lake Lahontan, a massive prehistoric lake that dried up thousands of years ago during a shift in the region's climate. What is left behind is called a playa, a flat, cracked, alkaline lake bed that looks like solid ground for 51 weeks of the year. But that solid appearance is deceptive. The surface is made of a fine clay that, once wet, does not just get muddy. It becomes something closer to wet cement, a sticky, suctioning paste that can trap a vehicle, a bicycle, or a human foot in seconds. A National Weather Service meteorologist in Reno later described the Playa mud as so thick that stepping into it could leave a person stuck for a while, unable to pull free without losing a shoe or their balance entirely. Veteran attendees sometimes joke that the Playa is the only place on Earth where dust and mud are somehow both the enemy, and that joke exists precisely because, for most of Burning Man's history, this has never mattered, since rain almost never falls on the Playa during the festival. The last time any measurable rain had touched the event was back in 2014, and before that, the only other significant rainfall had come in 2001. Attendees do not pack rain jackets. They do not pack boots. They pack sunscreen, dust masks, and water for a desert that regularly hits triple-digit heat during the day. The 2023 event, officially the 35th Burning Man gathering, ran from August 27th through September 4th, and an estimated 73,000 people made the trip out to Black Rock City that year. Just days before the event even opened, Tropical Storm Hillary had already dumped rain on the region, which oddly worked in the festival's favor at first. The moisture packed down the loose Playa dust, meaning the usual whiteout dust storms that plague Burning Man were largely absent during setup week. Camps went up smoothly. Massive art installations were towed into place across the open desert, ranging from a giant mechanical flamingo to a spinning wheel built entirely out of skeleton figures. A 40-foot catapult was rigged to launch flaming pianos into the night sky. At the very center of it all sat the wooden effigy the entire event is named for, standing tall in the middle of the horseshoe-shaped city, waiting to be burned on the festival's final night, just as it had been every year since that first bonfire on the beach. Burning Man's entire culture is built around a principle its organizers call radical self-reliance. There are no vendors selling food, no corporate sponsors setting up booths, and no bottled water for sale anywhere on the Playa. Every single person who enters Black Rock City is expected to bring everything they will need to survive for a week in the desert. Their own shelter, their own food, their own water, their own power, and their own way of getting around. This is by design. The idea is that nobody is a passive consumer at Burning Man. Everyone is a participant who helps build the temporary city with their own resources. For most of the year, this system works because the desert stays dry and predictable, but self-reliance only functions as a safety net when people can accurately predict what they will need. And on the afternoon of Friday, September 1st, what they needed changed instantly. A storm system tied to moisture from the southwest monsoon moved directly over the Black Rock Desert that Friday, dropping close to an inch of rain in just a few hours, an amount meteorologists later compared to 2 or 3 months of the region's typical rainfall, arriving all at once. On dry ground, an inch of rain is barely an inconvenience. On a playa made of fine, water-repellent clay with nowhere for the runoff to drain, it was catastrophic. Within hours, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning covering the area, one that would remain in effect through the following Monday. The single road connecting Black Rock City to the outside world, an 8-mile stretch known as Gate Road that fed onto Highway 34, became too saturated to drive on safely. Organizers made the call to shut it down entirely, along with the small local airstrip that some wealthier attendees used to fly in and out. For the first time in the festival's modern history, there was no way in and no way out of Burning Man. Part of what made the situation feel so dire was just how isolated Black Rock City actually is. The site sits roughly 120 miles from the nearest airport in Reno, connected to civilization by a single stretch of 2-lane highway, and then that final 8-mile dirt road onto the Playa. Under normal conditions, that isolation is part of the appeal, a way of stepping fully outside modern life for a week. Once the flooding hit and cell towers went down across most of the site, that same isolation turned into a communications blackout. Organizers scrambled to bring in mobile cell trailers and expand their internal Wi-Fi network to a handful of locations around the city. But for the first day or so, most of the 70,000 people out there had no way to check news, call family, or even coordinate with friends camped just a few blocks away, let alone reach emergency services quickly if something went wrong. Attendees who had spent the week posting scenic photos of art cars and desert sunsets were now filming something very different. Videos began circulating showing entire camps submerged under standing water, tents with collapsed frames, and long lines of people trudging barefoot through calf-deep mud just to reach a friend's camp a few hundred feet away. Some burners tried to make the best of it, wrapping plastic shopping bags around their shoes in a makeshift fashion statement that attendees jokingly nicknamed Playa Trash Bag Couture. Others treated the flooding as just another absurd Burning Man story, dancing barefoot in the rain and sculpting little clay figures out of the mud pooling around their tents. But underneath the jokes, a more serious problem was setting in. Organizers instructed all 70,000 attendees to shelter in place, stop driving or riding any vehicle across the wet playa, and begin rationing food, water, and fuel, because nobody could say with any certainty how many days it would take for the ground to dry out enough for a safe exit. Inside individual camps, the rationing got specific fast. Camp leaders held meetings to lay out new rules for the group. Showers were suspended entirely, hand and dishwashing was limited to a quick spray from a bottle instead of running water, and generators were switched on and off in short bursts rather than left running, purely to stretch out a limited fuel supply that nobody had expected to need this badly. Some campers described their tents essentially becoming small lakes overnight, with several inches of standing water pooling inside even well-built shelters, forcing people to spend hours the next morning wringing out towels and blankets just to make their space livable again. One attendee who had brought an older generation shelter later admitted that puddles had formed at all 4 corners of his tent by morning, while campmates using newer, better-sealed versions of the same shelter stayed nearly damp, a small but telling difference in how unevenly the flooding hit people who were all technically playing by the same self-reliance rules. By Friday night, the situation had escalated enough that it made national news. Reports spread that the Pershing County Sheriff's Office was investigating a death at the festival, and within hours, rumors online had twisted that single tragedy into wild stories about electrocutions in the floodwater and a city on the verge of total collapse. The truth, once it came out days later, was less dramatic but still tragic. The person who died was identified as 32-year-old Leon Reese, and Pershing County officials eventually determined that his death was caused by acute toxicity from a combination of cocaine, alcohol, and MDMA, unrelated to the weather or the flooding at all. But in the moment, with cell service knocked out across most of the playa and only scattered pockets of internet access, misinformation traveled faster than the facts could catch up to it. And outside the gates, the country was left to imagine the worst. The Pershing County Sheriff's Office later revealed it had fielded a wave of false reports claiming there had been a shooting and even a riot breaking out inside Black Rock City. Some of the calls reportedly coming from overseas phone numbers with no connection to anyone actually on the ground. None of it was true. By the time the festival wrapped, authorities confirmed a total of 13 arrests over the entire week, a relatively unremarkable number for an event of that size, and nowhere close to the lawless chaos that rumors online had described. Word of the disaster reached far beyond Burning Man's usual audience because of who else happened to be trapped inside Black Rock City that weekend. Tens of thousands of ordinary attendees were stuck alongside comedian Chris Rock, DJ and producer Diplo, actor Austin Butler, members of model Cara Delevingne's circle, and even the former acting Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal, who later described his own escape as a harrowing 6-mile hike through mud that stuck to his boots like wet cement. Suddenly, a festival known mostly for dusty photos of art cars and half-naked strangers was trending for an entirely different reason, and mainstream outlets that had never covered Burning Man before were now leading their broadcasts with it. The disparity in how people experienced the flood quickly became its own story. Wealthier attendees, staying in fully outfitted recreational vehicles, had raised floors above the standing water, private generators, stocked kitchens, and real beds, meaning they could ride out the storm in relative comfort, occasionally stepping outside just long enough to snap a photo of the mud before retreating back into a rammed, dry interior. The group reportedly stopped to rest at an impromptu roadside bar, chatting with strangers who had also chosen to walk rather than wait, before eventually flagging down that ride the rest of the way into town. He was far from the only one who tried walking. Attendee Amar Singh Duggal told reporters that his own 2-mile trek through the mud felt like walking with cinder blocks strapped to his feet, and it still took his group roughly 2 hours just to reach a road where a car could pick them up, a pace that gives some sense of just how physically draining the ground had become for anyone without a vehicle. Organizers eventually discouraged people from attempting the walk at night, warning it was too dangerous in the dark, and arranged buses from the nearby town of Gerlach to carry stranded walkers onward to Reno once they made it that far. By Sunday, September 3rd, the rain had mostly slowed to scattered showers, but the ground still had not dried enough to safely reopen the road. The driving ban remained in place, and with it, the shelter-in-place order. Not everyone respected the restrictions. Throughout the weekend, roughly 300 vehicles attempted to leave anyway, carving their own makeshift paths across the wet Playa instead of waiting for Gate Road to reopen. Almost all of them got stuck. Even 4-wheel drive vehicles built for off-road conditions sank axle-deep into the clay. And organizers later confirmed that those who jumped the line and got stuck would be among the very last people towed out once recovery operations began, since their abandoned vehicles were now blocking the very road everyone else needed to use. Burning Man's leadership tried to keep panic contained throughout the weekend. CEO Marion Goodell told reporters directly that there was no cause for panic, framing the event's famous self-reliance as an asset rather than a liability, since attendees had, by design, arrived with enough food, water, and shelter to handle exactly this kind of emergency. To some extent, that framing held up. Despite dramatic headlines comparing the scene to a disaster film, there were no confirmed outbreaks of illness during the flooding. Portable toilets were serviced again as soon as trucks could reach them once the ground began drying, and the vast majority of the roughly 70,000 people stranded on the playa were reported to be in good spirits, if extremely muddy ones. The White House was reportedly monitoring the situation as well, with President Biden briefed on conditions at the festival, given that it takes place on land managed by the Federal Bureau of Land Management. Still, for a festival that prided itself on having no headliners, no corporate sponsors, and no safety net beyond what people carried in themselves, the flood exposed just how fragile that self-reliance could become the moment nature refused to cooperate. The festival's traditional closing ritual, the burning of the wooden man at the center of the city, is normally the emotional peak of the entire week. In 2023, organizers were forced to delay it twice. It had originally been scheduled for Saturday night, but with the ground too wet and unstable to safely bring in heavy equipment and fire crews, the burn was pushed to Sunday, then pushed again when scattered storms rolled back through the area that evening. It finally happened on Monday night, September 4th, 2 full days later than planned, with a noticeably smaller and muddier crowd than usual gathered to watch it, since thousands of attendees had already begun their slow crawl out of the desert by then. That exodus officially began at 2 in the afternoon on Monday, when organizers announced that the driving ban had been lifted and that what they called exodus operations were underway. Even then, leaving was nowhere near instant. The original Gate Road had been rendered impassable by the roughly 300 vehicles that had gotten stuck trying to leave early over the weekend, their tires now locked in place as the surrounding clay baked and hardened around them in the returning sun. Recovery crews would need days, in some cases into the following week, just to tow those abandoned vehicles free. Organizers had to carve out an entirely new route across the drying playa to funnel traffic safely toward the highway, and even with the new road open, an estimated 64,000 people were reportedly still on site as the exodus began Monday afternoon, all trying to leave at roughly the same time. The resulting traffic jam stretched for hours, with departure times commonly running anywhere from 7 to 12 hours just to cross those final 8 miles of desert, leaving attendees to climb onto the roofs of their cars and RVs to wait out the gridlock in the open air. Satellite images taken from overhead that Monday showed an unbroken line of vehicles snaking across the drying Playa, a sight strange enough that news outlets ran it alongside the more emotional footage of muddy attendees finally reaching the highway on foot. Organizers, aware of exactly how bad that gridlock would get, had actually urged people to delay their departure until Tuesday if they could, reminding burners that anyone willing to wait out the man's delayed burn on Monday night could skip the worst of the traffic entirely. Plenty of exhausted attendees ignored that advice anyway, unwilling to spend one more night on a playa that had already cost them their tents, their supplies, and most of their patience. By the time the last stragglers finally made it past the gate and back onto paved highway, the story of Burning Man 2023 had already spread across the country, shaped by a mix of real hardship, celebrity gossip, and internet mockery that painted 70,000 so-called hippies as helpless victims of their own festival. The reality on the ground was more complicated than either the panic or the joke suggested. There was genuine danger in that mud, genuine scarcity of supplies as the days dragged on, and a genuine failure of the very infrastructure the event relies on every single year, the single road in and out of a city built on a dry lake bed that, it turned out, was never actually guaranteed to stay dry. But there was also resilience, cooperation between strangers, and a kind of dark humor that kept most of the 70,000 people trapped there from truly panicking, even as their tents sank and their food supplies dwindled by the hour. In the days after the exodus finally cleared, the criticism started rolling in from a different direction. Commentators online began comparing the flooded, gridlocked festival to the infamous Fire Festival collapse, even though the comparison did not entirely hold up, since Burning Man's attendees had, by design, brought their own supplies and were never abandoned without food, water, or shelter the way fire attendees had been. A writer for Vox took a different angle, criticizing the event for its environmental footprint, pointing out that tens of thousands of vehicles crossing a fragile desert lake bed, combined with the waste and debris left behind by a temporary city, carried its own ecological cost, regardless of how the flooding itself was handled. Burning Man's organizers pushed back on the doomsday narrative wherever they could, repeatedly stressing that the event had rehearsed scenarios like this one through tabletop safety drills long before 2023, and that the community's culture of mutual aid, not government intervention, was what got most of the 70,000 attendees through 4 uncomfortable days without serious injury. It was not even the first time flooding had threatened Burning Man. Organizers themselves had referenced an earlier storm back in 2013 that unexpectedly trapped roughly 160 attendees on the playa overnight, a much smaller preview of exactly the kind of scenario that would play out on a massive scale a decade later. What made 2023 different was scale. A hazard that once stranded a few hundred people overnight had now stranded tens of thousands for the better part of 4 days, testing every assumption Burning Man had built its identity around. The festival has always sold itself as a place where a temporary city can exist entirely on the self-sufficiency of the people inside it, cut off from the ordinary rules of modern life by choice. For one long, muddy weekend in September of 2023, that same isolation stopped being a philosophy and became a trap. In the years since, Burning Man's organizers have had to publicly reckon with what that weekend exposed. A festival whose entire identity rests on the idea that nobody needs to rely on outside infrastructure had just spent 4 days depending heavily on weather forecasts, emergency vehicles, and a single dirt road it did not control, all things far outside any individual attendee's self-reliance. Attendees who go back every year now talk about packing rain gear for the first time in the event's history, something that would have sounded absurd before 2023, when a single afternoon of monsoon rain was enough to trap 70,000 people who had prepared for triple-digit heat and dust storms, but never once for standing water. The Wooden Man still burns every year at the center of that horseshoe-shaped city, and the art cars still roll out across the open playa. But the 2023 flood left behind a lesson that Burning Man's culture of self-reliance had never quite had to learn before, that no amount of preparation can fully account for a desert that used to be a lake deciding, if only for one weekend, to become one again. The desert reminded 70,000 people all at once exactly who was really in control out there. And it is a lesson the festival has carried into every year that has followed since.